Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought I'd talk a little bit today about the Sword of Damocles and tactics and things like that. I'm not going to tell you the whole story of the Sword of Damocles. If you don't know what that is, that's the little sword hanging over your head by a string that could fall down on your head at any minute if you're not careful. And in chess, you don't want to do those things. I call them seeds of tactical destruction, where there are things in your position that might give your opponent a tactic. And if they're there, you want to get rid of them. You don't want to leave them hanging over your head. So I thought I'd take a recent student game that was played, and I don't have the whole game with the move order, but I have pretty much what it is. And let's take a look at it and see how Black, which was my student, could have thought about the positions and how he could have done a little better. And so we're going to teach you a little bit about the chess logic, the thought process, and a little bit about how to avoid and spot the tactics. All right, so let's take a look at the game. Here it is over here, Mr. Computer. White played e4, black played e6, French defense, d4, d5, e5 advanced variation. I did a little look at the Lichess databases, and I compared how often this was played in the regular master database compared to the average player database. They have both of them here. And if we go back and we look, after d5, e5 was played 17.3 million times, which is 29% in the average player database. And in the master database, e5 was only played 10%. So it's 3 times more likely if you're playing an average player that he's going to play e5 as it is if you're playing a strong player. And what's more, the lower the player you're playing, the more likely they play e5. Why do people play e5? Because they think, quote, it gains space, and they think that's the obvious thing you should do against the French defense. And while it's not a bad idea, I do tell my students that if you're white and you don't study the advanced variation and against the French and you just play it and Black knows what he's doing, it's very, very easy for Black to get the advantage against people who play white in the advanced variation if they have no idea where to put their pieces and how to develop. So actually the advanced variation is one of the more dangerous variations to play against the French if you don't know what you're doing. And ironically, it's the people who don't know what they're doing that play this much more often. Anyway, out of e5, we have the break move c5. White plays the move c3 to keep his pawn structure intact. Black continues with his pressure on d4 with knight c6. White plays knight f3. Black plays queen b6. And now if we look in the master database, by far the most common move here, which when I was playing was equally number one, but now it's become clear number one, is the very strange move a3 with the idea of playing b4 and blocking Black's advantage on the queen side. That's the most common move. The other most common move when I was playing was bishop e2, which keeps the queen guarding the d-pawn, and now Black would continue something like bishop d7 or maybe even knight to h6. All right, so after bishop to e2, that's the main line, but in this game, White plays bishop to d3. This is the Milner-Barry gambit. If Black plays it right and White plays it right, White should not try to hold on to the d-pawn. But right now, Black can't take the d-pawn. In fact, in John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students book, he uses this example where you can't take the pawn as his first example in Chapter 7, which is Discovered Attacks. And as we can see, a lot of people fall for this. Pawn takes, knight takes, queen takes, discovered attack, check. Okay, he's discovering the attack on the queen. And bishop to d7. And now queen takes d4 would be a mistake, losing the bishop for nothing. And I've seen people do that. They get too excited, too hasty. Of course, you should trade bishops first so you don't lose the bishop. It's check. And then take the queen. And you're just up an entire queen, basically, for, for a pawn. All right, so back to the game. So obviously, Black knew this, and he didn't fall for the trap. So he took the pawn, which is the right move. White took back, and now black plays bishop d7, which stops all these checks at the end and threatens to win this pawn. And it turns out there's no great way for white to save the pawn. If he plays bishop to e3, he's losing the b2 pawn. A lot of people who've never seen this before back off the bishop. They say, oh, I already moved my bishop on this diagonal, let's keep it on the diagonal. And now black can immediately go for winning the bishop pair. If white tries to save the bishop pair, black can threaten knight to d3 check with queen a6, also stopping white from castling. And you can see white's practically losing already, minus 1.2. So trying to save the pawn here is a bad idea. So white knew that, and he plays the book. The book move is to play castle, and he did. Knight takes, knight, and he plays bishop e3. The main line here is to play knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and then play knight c3. And the book move now, which the computers love for black, is to play a6. And you could see if black does this and plays a6, he's up 1.1. Well, 1.1, that's a monster number for black. That means black's practically winning already with thus play. That's why the Milner-Barry gambit is pretty much not played anymore at the high level. Okay, so back to the game. All right, I may be transposing here. White either played rook e1 or bishop e3. I think he played bishop e3 first, pinning the knight to the queen. So in this position, the knight on d4 now becomes the sword of Damocles, which is it's pinned to the queen and it's in danger of being lost, because when somebody's attacking something and you're trying to guard it, the person who's piling up on it has the big advantage over the person who's trying to keep guarding it and guarding it and guarding it, because the person who's piling up on it can either keep piling up or he can switch to something else, and the other person is stuck. He has to keep guarding the piece, and it's like you're trying to balance more and more rocks on top of each other. It becomes very, very difficult. So you want to get out of these things as soon as possible. Obviously here, black cannot play queen takes b2. Can you visualize that and see why queen takes b2 is no good? Well, the answer is that white can simply play bishop takes d4, winning the knight, but also the bishop on d4 is guarding the rook right through the queen on b2. Let's show you that if you can't visualize it. Queen takes b2, bishop takes d4, and the rook is guarded. In his book, Everyone's First Chess Workbook, Giannottos calls this idea an X-ray. In older books, they use X-ray synonymously with skewer, but I actually like Giannottos' use of the word X-ray here better, where you're sort of X-raying right through the queen, the guarding of the rook on a1. So clearly queen takes b2 is not a good move. Well, what are all the ways then that black can play safe moves? He could try to guard the knight, but how many moves does he have that add an extra guard? The answer is he could play bishop to c5, and that would guard the knight, but then white would have discovered threats with his bishop later on that knight to get a third piece attacking the knight, which would be the queen. So it's very dangerous to do that. So the easiest thing to do here would be to do something like to take, and if he takes back with the queen, now you can take the pawn, and when he saves the knight, you're hitting this pawn as well. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that white, instead of playing bishop e3 right away, played rook to e1 first. All right, well now, the knight on d4 is not pinned, but you still have the same problem, which is this bishop can make a discovered attack and add a second attacker to that knight. So you want to make it safe here. And there's two ways to do this. You could guard it with the bishop again, or you could just take the knight and be done with it. Play knight takes f3 check. All right, so in order to transpose to the game, we have to play bishop c5 and then bishop e3 again. And now we have that same question. Can we take the pawn on b2? What happens if we do that? Well, it gets a little complicated, but that's a good way to get into trouble, because White's the one who's ahead in development. He's the one who's castled. He has the rook in the center. He's got 3 of his 4 minor pieces out, which black does also. And if you stop to take that pawn here, you better calculate things really accurately, because now the queen has to guard the knight from this square, which is not so easy. The engine says you can get away with it if white plays knight bd2. The engine thinks you can play something like either b6 guarding the bishop, or maybe even queen to c3, and black is better. But that's dangerous. I mean, if you're not a good player, you got to be careful about snatching pawns like that. So there's a much better way to do this. All you have to do is say, I'm up a pawn, my knight's the guy who's in trouble, rather than keep him in trouble and trying to win a second pawn. After all, 1 pawn might be enough to win the game. The second pawn makes it easier, but if you're going to have trouble creating complications that are good for your opponent, that may not be worth it. So the easiest thing to do here is just start trading everything off. Play knight takes f3, check. It's check, so white has no choice. He doesn't want to really mess up his pawn structure, so let's say he takes with the queen. And now again, you really don't want to play queen takes b2. If you play queen takes b2 and hit the rook, white will take the bishop, you'll take the rook, and you say, oh, I just won the exchange. Winning the exchange means winning a rook for a bishop or a knight. It doesn't mean coming out ahead in a trade. When I test my new students and I say, what's winning the exchange mean? They almost all say coming out ahead in a trade, and I say, well, that's what it means in English, but in chess, it means winning a rook for a knight, and that's been standard for, over 100 years, that kind of nomenclature. All right, so in this position, that queen is out of play. The engine says white should play queen to g4, hitting this pawn. If black tries to save it, that weakens all his dark squares. Engine switches over to here, putting pressure on the dark squares. It's hard to get the knight out, and even though black is up material, it says white is better in this position. It's interesting. Right here it says queen b4 is better by 1.1, and now it says no, it's only better by about 0.2. Anyway, let's get back to the game. Good stuff that we can learn. So, very dangerous. So the easiest thing to do is just trade and say, look, my bishop is now sort of pinned to my queen. I can't move it anywhere. If I move my queen's tied down to guarding the bishop. Let's just trade it off. I'm up a pawn. Take there. What can white take back? If he takes with the wrong things, then maybe queen takes b2 becomes an idea. If he plays queen takes c3, we have a choice again of going into the endgame up a pawn or trying to win another pawn. The engine says it's not even close. Queen takes b2, as you can see, is not one of the top 3 moves here. But trading queens is. And now black just has a great endgame. He can develop his knight, get ready to castle. He could even leave his king in the middle. And black has this nice protected passed pawn, which is his extra pawn, with every reason to believe that he's going to be able to win this endgame. All right, so that's the easy way to get rid of the Sword of Damocles, is just trade it off. All right, so that's what the engine wants black to do, is trade it off. Black calculated quite correctly that white's not really threatening discovered attacks yet, so he thought maybe he could just develop a piece. And you can see with Stockfish's top 3 moves here that developing the piece with knight e7 is a perfectly good move. It leaves black up by 1.3. But just trading when you're winning is a really good thing, and you're just going to be better. So in the game, let's make this the main line. In the game, oh, black didn't play there. Let's get back to the main line, mister. All right, so rook to e1, bishop e3. In the game, black played knight e7. We'll make that the main line. Make main line. Thank you very much. All right, so now it's white's turn. And white sees that he doesn't have many discoveries, and he makes a really big mistake. Let's turn off the engine here so you can play along. White plays knight c3. Well, that looks like a reasonable developing move. c3 is a really good square for the knight. Why is that a big mistake, and how can black figure this out? All right, see if you can. If you want to pause the video and figure out what black should do, you can do that. Well, let's take a look. We have now some seeds of tactical destruction for both sides. The seed of tactical destruction for black, as we've been saying all along, is these pieces along this line and the fact that there's discovered attacks on the d4 square, which gives white a third guard. But if black looks at what white's doing, white's putting all his pieces right next to each other, where maybe he can get a geometric tactic. A couple months ago, I did a video called The Geometry of Chess Tactics, where I talked about stuff like this. So what could black do? Let's take the lines off the board. Well, you're always looking for your checks, captures, and threats. And if there's a tactic, it's going to start with a check, capture, threat. If your opponent has a tactic, it's going to start with a check, capture, threat. So the first question you should ask yourself is not just how many checks do you have, but how many safe checks do you have? And when I say safe, I mean, if you have a check where he can take off a piece, but then you could win his queen or something, that's still safe. In this position, black has knight f3 check, and he has knight e2 check. Well, if he plays knight e2 check, white has 4 pieces guarding that square, and black has nothing, so knight e2 check is not a candidate move. But knight f3 check is a candidate move, and it gets our sword of Damocles off that d4 square. It also removes one of the guards on the e5 square, even though black's not currently attacking e5. But it does something else. What else does knight takes f3 check do? Well, it's a tactic called clearance. There's attraction, there's deflection, there's clearance. This is clearance to form another tactic. What tactic are we forming? We're forming a double attack, or as we like to call them when the piece can go in 2 different directions, a fork. So we are playing knight f3 check to clear the d4 square for a pawn fork. So after knight f3 check, no matter how he takes it, black can look at playing a move like d4. Okay, now when you're playing a move like d4, you have to look at what white could do. Can he move the knight and attack the queen? Because if he could, that would be good for white, because then he'd be forking the queen and the bishop, and black's queen would be attacked, and he wouldn't have time to take the bishop on e3 because his queen's attacked. And the answer is no. Knight a4 doesn't work because of bishop a4. How about knight to d5, hitting the queen that way? Well, no, that doesn't work either. I can just take it with the knight, or maybe even take it with the pawn. So the knight moves that attack the queen don't work. How about a bishop move that does something? Could he play bishop here? And then if I take the knight, maybe he can play bishop takes g7. Well, first of all, that's not good for him. If black plays d takes c3, bishop g7, I'll just play rook g8, and you can have the pawn. Or I could play it the other way. I could, if I'm black, whoops, sorry, didn't mean to move that. Let's put it back where it belongs. All right, I'm trying to recenter the screen here. All right, so besides taking the knight and giving him the g-pawn, I could just take the bishop and let the knight move. Let's say knight e4, and he's got a check here, but, I should be able to survive with a little care. And again, black's just winning a piece. So in this position, we get a tactic to win a piece by looking at our checks, captures, and threats. Well, the first thing you're going to look at is the checks, and there's only one safe check. Well, you could look at it and say, what good does that do? But it starts out by doing something very good. It gets rid of that sword of Damocles, that knight that's kind of the hanging piece in the middle of the board. So it's not only a check, and it gives you another tempo, but it also gets rid of your biggest weakness while you're doing it. Also, it does a third thing. It trades pieces when you're up a pawn. And of course, if you can trade everything off when you're up a pawn and get into an endgame, that's the best way to convert the pawn. So everything in the world is telling us that knight f3 check is a strong candidate move. Now, does that make it the best move? Not necessarily. But once we see it and we say, well, what does it do? If we realize that we have the possibility of this geometric tactic with this knight on c3 and the bishop on e3, we now have 2 pieces on the same rank that are separated by 2 files. And in the video on the geometry of tactics, I said, well, when that happens, if you can get a pawn up there in between them that's guarded, or depending on whether he can take on d4 or not, then you're winning a piece. So here, black has this combination, winning a piece. And after the game, my student, when he sent us all the copy of his game, he said, this is right out of the Bain book or the Giannotto's book. it's black to play, and in 2 moves he wins a piece. He simply makes a check, and then he makes a pawn fork, and then on the next move he's going to pick up that piece. So, not hard, but he missed it. But you have the seeds of tactical destruction here, and you have 2 things telling you to do this. One is the offensive things of the possibility of the pawn fork, but there's also the defensive things that taking the knight is a desirable move anyway. So everything's telling you to look there, look there, look there, see if there's something there. So now my student makes a big mistake. Now, we already said earlier that white could move this bishop and get a 3rd attacker on this knight. For instance, he could play, let's do nothing for black. White could play knight takes, bishop takes, and then play something like, I don't know, bishop takes h7. With the idea that if black takes the bishop on h7, then white can win his pawn back on d4 and end up winning a pawn. The problem with stuff like that is you don't have to let him take the bishop here. This is a desperado bishop. And when you have that, just because the bishop took on h7 and you can take the bishop first, this becomes what I call a counting problem. You have to count which things should you take first in order to do it. Well, you can't take the knight with the bishop because that's pinned to your queen and he'll take your queen. But what you can do is take the bishop on e3 first. That's the piece that's hanging. That's the one you want to take him with. Take him with the piece that's hanging, and now, no matter what white does, he's going to end up behind. If he saves the bishop on h7 so the rook can't take it, then black can continue to win things on f2. But if white stops that by taking the bishop on e3, then black will take the bishop on h7. And again, our counting ends up with the fact that black is ending up winning a piece. What does all that mean? It means that even though this bishop can get discovered attacks on that knight, it's not necessarily going to win something, but if you let it sit there long enough, it might do that. So in this position, black played, I think, knight to g6. But see, the seeds are already there. If the bishop can take something, he's got a discovered 3rd attacker on the knight. You don't want the thing that he's going to take to become worth it more and more and more, because then the tactic of trying to take the knight might do something. So in this position, white can play bishop takes g6. All right, there's that 3rd attacker. If you wait this long, you might get into trouble, but luckily for black, he's got something to save himself. What would possibly save black in this position? Because, again, just because the bishop took on g6, and you can take back with 2 different pawns, that doesn't mean it's the only way to get your piece back. Because if you can make a capture with any piece anywhere on the board, then you can at least temporarily get material back. In this particular case, the desperado piece is the knight on d4. He's the one that you're going to lose if you take that bishop on g6. Is there anything I can do with my desperado piece so that I can save it, and then later on maybe I can capture the bishop on g6? And the answer is, of course. You can play knight takes f3 check. It's the fact that it's a check that saves you, because now white has to get out of the check by the rules of the game. And no matter how he gets out of check, let's say queen takes f3, your bishop is guarded, your queen is okay, you're not worried about getting forked on a4. That means you have time to take the bishop on g6 and remain up a pawn. Notice that white has no Zwischenzug here. After knight takes check, he can't play bishop takes check and get a pawn for his bishop before he loses it, because he's in check. He can't do that. He has to take the knight, and now you take toward the center and open up the line for your rook. And this counting problem tells you that even though knight to g6 gave white the opportunity to win material, he's not actually winning material, because if he takes this knight, we can take the knight check. Suppose he takes that knight and we panic and we say, oh no, he's got a discovery on my knight, I guess I'm losing it, and we just take the bishop. Well, now he can take the knight with the knight or the bishop. I would take with the bishop to force more trades here, because now white's up an entire piece. And if you're up an entire piece, you want to trade, so I would take with the bishop to force more trades, and now black can just resign. He's down a piece because he missed the Zwischenzug, knight takes f3 check. Well, why did he lose the knight? For one reason, he had multiple chances to take off that knight, multiple chances. And once he does that, there's no pressure there anymore. The sword of Damocles is gone. But once white played bishop takes g6, now it didn't become a preference anymore or a nicety. It became a necessity. The only move on the board that gives black a decent game is to take the knight. Every other move will lose. If we ask the engine here, let's promote this, make this the main line. If we say to Mr. Engine, what are the top 3 moves? Look at the difference between number 1 and number 2. If you play the best move and you don't lose the piece, black's still up a pawn and the engine rates you as better by minus 1.3. If you fail to do that and you give him an entire piece by capturing on g6 and let him capture on d4, then white's up by 6.5. So it's an 8-pawn mistake not to do that. Now, if you panic in this kind of position, and when someone takes you, all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, he's got another guy on my knight. Well, it may be too late by that point. Maybe you did lose a piece. But before you acquiesce, that's the term I use, before you acquiesce and just give him the piece, look around, look at your desperado piece, see if there's a counting sequence where maybe you can lose less or maybe not lose anything at all. In this case, you're not losing anything at all. But if you panic, you might not take the time to look at it. It's still very ironic because the only move that saves black is his only safe check on the board. And when you're looking for tactics, whether it's defensive tactics to save yourself or offensive tactics to win things, you're always looking at checks, captures, and threats. And in this case, your only safe check, which should be the very first move you look at, is the one that saves you. It's true, a lot of people, when they see this position and they see the bishop takes, the first move they're going to look at is just recapturing. But I think black saw that if he just recaptures, he's losing. But then he figured, oh, I'm going to lose it anyway, not realizing he has this check that gives him time to save the knight, and the game became lost. All right, so today we talked a little bit about thought process, Damocles Sword, checks, captures, and threats, move orders, counting sequences. These are the kind of basic things, these basic patterns that win and lose games. It's not how well you knew the Milner-Barry gambit. It's not how well you knew the Lucena endgame. Figuring out these basic counting sequences, these basic analytical ideas, these basic ideas of safety, they're the things that are going to move you up the ladder. Once you get to be 17, 1800, then they become more of second nature. And people who are watching this video who are rated 2000 are going to say, hey, Dan, everything you said in this video I learned when I was much lower. And the answer is, yes, you did. But there's an awful lot of people out there that still get these kind of things wrong. And the more you see it, the more you hear good players analyze and talk to you, the better you get. If you really like my videos, the best thing you can do is tell all your friends at your chess club, print out YouTube/C/Dan Heisman Chess and hand it out at your local club or your tournament or whatever and say, hey, watch this guy's channel. It's really good. He's got good stuff on there covering all aspects of chess improvement. I really would appreciate it if you do something like that. If you don't, I understand. You can also subscribe to the channel. You can like the video. We'll see you next time. Bye.